This lecture is part of the History 363 Modern Africa class at Flagler College. Today we're talking about World War II and its aftermath in Africa, the course of the war itself, and the consequences in the immediate aftermath of the war, really up until about the early to mid 1950s. So the war itself was fought partially in Africa. There were strategic locations there. Egypt was a particularly important place because the Axis powers determined that Egypt, and they were right about this, that Egypt was the gateway to the British control of the Middle East, and especially to the oil resources that the British extracted from places like Saudi Arabia and especially Iran. And so there was a great effort made to take Egypt, and some of the kind of key battles early in the war, kind of actually in the middle stages of the war, happened in North Africa. As early as the late 1940, Italy, who had, of course, possession of Libya, tried to invade Egypt. Italy also controlled Somalia or what was then known as Somaliland, and Eritrea, and so it had taken over Ethiopia as well. But I'll come to that in a moment here. But so Egypt really was the target, and Germans later got involved in that too. Ethiopia had, of course, been independent previous to the mid-1930s. Italy had tried to claim Ethiopia as a colonial possession in the late 19th century as part of the scramble for Africa, but if you recall, Ethiopia managed to arm their military with fairly advanced weapons and defeated the Italians at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. Well, under Mussolini, Ethiopia was seen as something that the Ethiopians needed to extend their hegemony over so that they could sort of realize their imperialist intentions. And so Ethiopia was also a theater in the war. Also preliminarily to comment on this, the loyalty of the colonial subjects in Africa was an important question during the war and also had an influence on the way things happened after the war. South Africa remained with the British during the war, even despite the reluctance of many of the Afrikaners who lived there. There were some Afrikaners who tried to call for at least neutrality, if not outright support of Germany, given that their racial policies were, in many cases, more in line with the thinking of the Nazis than they were with the British. And their heritage was definitely continental European rather than British, and so there was some amount of opposition to involvement with the British. But just as happened in World War I, Jan Christian Smuts, who was the Prime Minister of South Africa at the time, took the South Africans into the war on the side of the British, and in fact Smuts himself ended up again, as he had done in the First World War, serving as a kind of key military commander on the British side. He was an Afrikaner, but educated at Cambridge University and very much an Anglophile, kind of an exception among Afrikaners. So South Africa did side with the British. They did push through a stipulation that black Africans would not be allowed to use weapons in the military where South African troops were fighting. I mean, there were racial policies that they tried to bring to bear, even in the atmosphere of the war. Algeria and the rest of North Africa was in a difficult situation because, of course, Germany took over France early in the first half of 1940, came to control Paris and set up a puppet regime in southern France called Vichy. And the colonial possessions in Africa and Asia belonged to the French, but France, of course, now was controlled by Germany. And so Germany, as is depicted in the movie Casablanca, which if you haven't seen, it's it's a classic film, of course, but it actually portrays things quite well, things that were going on kind of in the middle phase of the war there. I mean, the movie itself was made during the war. I think it came out in 1942 or 1943, and so it depicts this, sorry for the yawn there, it depicts this situation where in Casablanca, which of course is in Morocco, you have, the Germans have been victorious over the French, and so you have these Vichy officials who are siding with the Germans, and you have Germans there, and they're trying to take over control of Morocco from the French, and but you also have agents of the Free French, and at one point there's this pivotal scene where they're in a bar. It's the main character, Humphrey Bogart. It's kind of his place, and he's an American, of course, but the band plays the Marseillaise sort of as an expression of solidarity with the Free French rather than with the Nazis. And so, I mean, that movie actually does quite a good job at depicting what was going on there. But initially, many of these colonial subjects expressed their somewhat reluctant loyalty to Vichy, but as soon as the Free French movement led by Charles de Gaulle gained any kind of traction, the colonial subjects switched over to the Free French, and so the Algerians, the Tunisians, the Moroccans, the Senegalese, and others, were definitely on the side of the Free French, and that would have consequences for the way that they interacted with the French after the war. To return to Ethiopia, Ethiopia really was a kind of symbol of Africa's involvement in the war and the consequences, both positive and negative, for Africa as a result of the war. Ethiopia in the 1930s was the words here on the slide are diplomatic sacrifice. Ethiopia was an independent nation. It was acknowledged as independent by European countries. It was part of the League of Nations. It was, of course, a Christian country. But the Italians, who were still smarting from their defeat at the Battle of Adwa, they saw this as a historical embarrassment. Now that they had come to what they felt was higher power and greater strength under Mussolini, under the fascist system there, they wanted another crack at Ethiopia. They still felt that it was their possession. And so Il Duce, as he was known, or Mussolini, made an argument to other European countries that Ethiopia was actually a historical anachronism, that it was a backward, medieval, primitive kind of country with ruled over by an autocratic king, and that it had no place in his mind in the 20th century, that the only thing that should be done with Ethiopia was that it should be subjected to European rule, and its sort of savage tendencies tamed by European civilization. In saying this, Mussolini was really kind of a throwback to the sort of rhetoric that was being passed around African circles in European circles about Africa in the 1880s and 1890s, around the time of the Berlin Conference. Most Europeans had moved beyond that with their opinions by this point, but much has happened with the Sudetenland and with Austria and others in Europe. The British and the French trying to appease the expansionist tendencies of the Italians in this case, really seeing no stake in defending Ethiopia, refused to back it up, even though Haile Selassie, who's pictured here, the Emperor of Ethiopia, made an appeal to the League of Nations. It went completely unheeded. And now, with much more advanced military technology, the Italians attacking from Somalia and Eritrea ended up overrunning Ethiopia and forcing Haile Selassie to flee the country. He ended up in London. And while he was there, some really sort of curious things ended up happening. I apologize for all the yawns. I'm filming this actually quite late in the evening, and it's been a long day for me. But in any case, sorry for the personal anecdotes there. Haile Selassie became a figure of some international prestige, particularly among people of African origin, all over the African diaspora, and especially in the Caribbean, though to some extent among even among African Americans. He was held up as this great symbol of a proud and ancient black civilization that had been undone, had been betrayed by the Europeans who claimed to support it. And this was another he became really the symbol of negritude, or of black consciousness. I guess I really shouldn't use those terms. Black consciousness is a term that really comes into use later in the 1960s, 1970s. But a sense of sort of African pride, a solidarity of all black people across the world, and this was especially keen. We've talked about this already a little bit, the emergence of negritude in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. Well, it really steps up, and Haile Selassie becomes the symbol of negritude, the symbol of black African pride. He also became, for some, a religious figure, almost a messianic figure. There were some, and this started in the Caribbean, and it spread to Africa and other places from there. But this notion that he was a holy religious figure descended directly from King Solomon of the Bible. In some cases, this even took on messianic tones, with ideas that Haile Selassie was perhaps, the resurrected Christ, or in any case that he was a messenger of Jesus, a legitimate Christian ruler. And along with this went a lot of the kind of African innovations, or black innovations of Christianity, including, the idea of a black Jesus, and other things. This coalesced really into the famous Rastafarian movement. That's not just, Bob Marley and wearing clothes of yellow, red, and green, maybe smoking marijuana. Those things actually do end up as part of the Rastafarian movement in places and at times later on. But that began with this semi-worship or veneration of Haile Selassie during the late 1930s and early 1940s. In fact, the word Rastafarian comes from the title that was given by these believers to Haile Selassie, Ras, meaning prince, and then Tafari, which is a sort of corruption of I think the Amharic name or something like that. I can't remember exactly what that means, but so the Rastafarian movement was a direct reference to Haile Selassie. Haile Selassie really didn't do anything to discourage this kind of veneration. He channeled this to try to bring greater attention to his country. The Italians, now that they controlled most of the Horn of Africa, Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, once the war began, so they took over Ethiopia in 1935, 1936. Once the war began, Ethiopia became a staging ground for the attempted Libyan invasion of other parts of Africa, or at least the Italians seemed to be trending in that fashion, that they were going to attack Kenya and Uganda, which were British possessions, of course. And so the British, rather than wait for the Italians to do that, ended up attacking Libya, and completely drove the Italians out, not only of Libya, but also the rest of the Horn of Africa by early 1941. And Haile Selassie, who had fled to London in 1936, ended up going back to Ethiopia and resuming rule over his country Though this had a couple of consequences. The British did leave advisors there and military there, and so they began to set up a kind of semi-colonial apparatus in Ethiopia, whereas there had been none previous to that time. And so that was sort of a negative consequence for Ethiopia. On the other hand, with the gaining of Eritrea, all of the plans that earlier Ethiopian emperors had tried to put into place of retaking the coastland that had been anciently part of the kingdom of Merowe and other descendants of that early kind of ancient Ethiopia. And so we talked about this, that Theodros and Johannes had attempted in the 19th century to extend their hegemony over Eritrea and gain access to the Red Sea coast in the Horn of Africa. Well, Haile Selassie now had the same sorts of plans and tried to put those into operation now that Eritrea was also a British possession and connected to Ethiopia. And that was problematic because most of the people of Eritrea were Muslim and culturally more akin to the Arabian Peninsula and maybe to Egypt. And so this would lead to some conflict, and it's a rivalry between Eritreans and Ethiopians. Multifaceted rivalry that continues all the way to the present. Eritrea, of course, later became independent of Ethiopia and remains so today. The most famous theater of the war, though, was not Ethiopia, but it was the coast. The Italians tried to attack Egypt from Libya in, I think, late 1941, and they were not very well organized at this, and the British, knowing how vital Egypt was, ended up counterattacking and defeating the Italians, and then drove their troops into Libya, where they ran into the newly instituted German Afrika Korps, headed by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the famous field marshal during World War II, maybe the most effective military strategist, apart perhaps from Hans Guderian, of the entire German effort. So Rommel had set up the Afrika Korps there, and the British were not only halted by Rommel, but turned back, and without reinforcements forthcoming. Actually, both sides suffered from a lack of manpower in the Africa theater throughout the campaign. But Rommel was able to drive the British back into Egypt and looked destined to take Cairo, and was only turned back finally in October 1942 at a pivotal battle called El Amin. And El Amin really was one of the key battles of the war, because if Germany had been able to take Cairo, they would have had easy access. It really were. I mean, that was where the British were making their stand to defend the Middle East. They would have been able to cross the Sinai and then down into the Arabian Peninsula and maybe even over to the Persian Gulf area, which would have given them access to a lot of oil, which is one of the things, of course, that they had a difficult time with during the war, having access to. So that could have changed a lot of things. One of the consequences of not having enough oil was that they were never able to, Hitler had to make a decision of whether to kind of support a larger U-boat force or more tanks and mechanized vehicles for land forces or airplanes. I mean, he had to kind of portion out his resources based partly on access to fuel. And if more U-boats had been put into the Atlantic, it could have tipped the balance in favor of the Germans, because U-boats tended to be really important to that campaign, really destructive and difficult to defeat. Anyway, I'm sort of waxing on here about World War II. We can see how important actually the Africa theater is from that. So the British turned back the Germans, and then it was difficult fighting, sort of inch by inch, really, back on a westwardly direction, but with sort of pushing back and forth there between the British and the Germans. In late 1942, or yeah, I guess it was late 1942, the Americans then made an attack from their bases in Gibraltar and the Mediterranean on the western part of North Africa, or the Maghreb region. They invaded Morocco and Algeria, linked up with Free French forces and Free French support colonial troops there, and ended up advancing from the west, and ultimately drove the Axis, the Germans and the Italians, out of North Africa by May 1943, and that prompted, from there they were able to then land in Italy. I did not mention that one of the things that they had to take into consideration during this whole saga was the nationalism of these people. The Egyptians, many of them, were very reluctant to support the British during the war, because the British had so severely interfered with their nationalist efforts earlier. Egypt really was early in terms of African countries making this transition to a desire for independence. Technically, the British had granted Egypt independence in 1922 and had set up democratic elections there. And the party that ended up winning the majority of seats in the would-be parliament of Egypt, the Waft Party, under the leadership of Saad Zaghloul, who was a kind of pivotal figure then, ended up being, the British were not happy that they achieved a majority of seats in the parliamentary election, and so under the system, which was a kind of constitutional monarchy that the British had set up with a king of Egypt, they convinced the king to, as the chief executive, to disband the parliament that had been elected and to call for another parliamentary election. And they ended up doing this over the course of the 1920s and 30s like 3 or 4 times. Every time they didn't, the political fortunes turned against the interests of the British, they convinced the king to dissolve the government and call for new parliamentary elections. And so that did 2 things. It hurt the British in the eyes of the Egyptians to the point where they were almost willing to support the Germans, despite their sort of racial rhetoric. And they certainly didn't give a lot of assistance to the British during this whole World War II campaign. But this also ended up decreasing the legitimacy of the Waft Party, which was the first true kind of modern political party in Egypt, and paved the way for more radical nationalist groups to come to the fore in Egypt, especially the Muslim Brotherhood, which we'll talk about in a few minutes here. So that's what Africa went through during the war. It should be said that there were some African troops. By the end of the war, there were 370,000 African troops who had been recruited and were fighting actively on the side of the British. And they did fight in active campaigns even outside of Africa, particularly in Asia. There were large African units in Burma, for instance, during the campaign against the Japanese. And they were support troops and support staff in other areas. I don't think a lot of Africans fought in Europe, though they may have had a kind of supporting role at times. But the lessons of World War II for those who fought in the war and those who were involved were very important. And really, they're the same kinds of lessons that some Africans learned in the First World War. The fact that Europeans are not invincible. The fact that they who tout their superior civilization end up causing and fighting the most disastrous, destructive war in human history. The fact that Europeans personally are capable both of great bravery and great cowardice, great acts of heroism and great cruelty. Seeing these things firsthand was a tremendous lesson for many of these Africans, and it's not coincidental that some of the leaders of the nationalist movements after the war end up being people who fought in the war. So the lessons of war were tremendously important. The other thing that the Africans took away from this is that the Europeans owed them. So the Algerians, who had been the victims of not only kind of enhanced colonialism, but even outright annexation and subordination to the French settlers who had come into Algeria and settled in the coastland. Well, they, despite all of that, had sided with the Free French and sided with de Gaulle. And so after the war, these Algerians and Tunisians and Egyptians, Moroccans, and even those from areas of sub-Saharan Africa like Senegal and the Gold Coast and Uganda and South Africa, who had participated in the war, fought in the war, or at least given their support in one way or another to the Allies, felt that they were owed something. They were owed a greater voice in their own government, a greater measure of self-determination. And the confidence that Africans had by the end of the war really was vital to this. The sense of entitlement, as it were, a necessary sense of entitlement, was a great precursor to the drive for independence in the 1950s and the growing nationalism. And there were other challenges to European hegemony too. The American presence in Africa was big. That Americans thought very differently. Many of them were opposed to imperialism. Roosevelt certainly was, and influenced Churchill in that regard, or at least Churchill was willing to listen to Roosevelt's opposition to imperialism and begin to talk about moving in a different direction. There were American troops in North Africa who had a very different mindset and interacted with Africans at times. And so, the United States did play a role in all of this. And I talked about the loyalty to the Free French and the loyalty to the British. That was important too. Now, after the war, with this sense of entitlement, figures like Sidi Mohammed, who's pictured here, and Ferhat Abbas, one of the Algerian leaders who's pictured here with the kind of Russian-looking cap. I think that's a North African fez, actually. And Habib Bourguiba, who was the leader of the Neo-Dastour party in Tunisia. These all began to foment for not necessarily outright independence, but at least greater representation in their own government, maybe seats in the parliament of the metropole, and ultimately a greater sense of autonomy in their own territories, with potentially a transfer of power within a foreseeable distance. Some took a much harder line and a much more radical approach to this. So with the kind of waning of the influence, the popularity of the Waft Party in Egypt, more radical parties who were willing to take more desperate steps to try to rid themselves of the influence of the British came to the fore in Egyptian politics. On the secular side, we have something called the Young Egypt Party, one of these kind of youth movements, and then, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood, which had been founded in 1928, really began to take on a different cast and to become very active politically. The Muslim Brotherhood, although they continued to insist on Sharia and strict adherence to the tenets of Islam, really had a religious focus. At the same time, they became more willing to participate in the structures of government, though they wanted some guarantees that they were going to be given greater autonomy for this. And so we have kind of a spectrum of political figures emerging in North Africa as a result of the war. Africa had supplied a lot of the resources necessary for the war, whether we're talking about rubber or foodstuffs or minerals. It was, for instance, uranium from the Congo that was used to make both of the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that's just one small instance of African resources used at key moments in the war. Of course, it's a very important moment, but Africa had been milked really for its resources during the war, and Africa came to be seen even more than it had been previously as a place of tremendous resource that could be beneficial, continue to be beneficial for the European powers, and that's primarily the way they treated Africa after the war. I'll have more to say about that. And so, as we'll see here, many of these European countries resolved to renew their intervention in Africa to make Africa even more productive, given the state of destruction that places like France and Belgium, and to some extent Britain, were in at the end of the war. The resources coming from Africa were seen by many as tremendously important for rebuilding the economy and the infrastructure of the European countries. And really, this is totally short-sighted and completely unfair to the Africans who were not really considered in part of this, that the resources could be used to build infrastructure and things like that in Africa. That doesn't seem to have occurred to any of these Europeans. Africa, for them, as it had been, was seen as a big piggy bank, right, where they could get resources and money to build up their own countries again. And that's going to create a legacy of great bitterness, especially as they continue to intervene in ways that were more and more invasive. After the war, a group of educated elites really come to the fore in African politics, whereas up to this point the British and the French and others had used mostly indirect rule chiefs. They were the key interlocutors, the key partners in the colonial experience of the Europeans. Well, after the war, really during the war to some extent as well, the indirect rule chiefs were seen more and more as unreliable partners and really kind of out of their league when it came to governing. And so there was a kind of shift in the European mindset and to some extent the African mindset to prefer those who had been educated in the United States or in Europe as partners in not only African government and the extraction of African resources, but to some extent with an eye on eventually shifting power, at least some kind of greater autonomy, over to Africans. And the thought was, okay, if we partner with the educated elite, we can convince them, because we speak the same language, we have a similar background in education, that being friendly to the economic interests of the metropole or of the former colonial power is in their interests. It was thought that these educated people would be more pliable because they would understand the broader context. Well, in truth, and maybe Europeans should have recognized this, it seems kind of obvious in hindsight, these educated people were in fact more reluctant than the chiefs were to do business with the Europeans and to kind of kowtow to European interests. They saw what existed in Europe and the United States, and they said there's no reason why Africans shouldn't have the same sorts of things, especially given the volume of resources that we have. And so by the 1945 meeting of the Pan-African Congress, a lot of these educated elites had come together and were beginning to talk with one another about new political aims. No longer kind of finding a place in the colonial system, but rather talking about greater autonomy, a transfer of power, more and more to Africans, at least, the very least, greater representation in European governments of African interests, and potentially, kind of with a view toward the horizon, full independence for Africa. Now, we'll see that the differences of opinion here end up being pretty definitive. The state of the colonial powers at the end of the war was, well, I mean, in general, not good. They had suffered tremendously. Not Portugal so much, which wasn't involved a whole lot in the war, but certainly Britain, France, Belgium, and Italy had suffered greatly. Britain, because it had been bombed so badly by the Luftwaffe, and because it had expended a Herculean amount of resources, manpower, lives to win the war. Of course, allied with the United States, but the British did a lot of the actual fighting. I think in Europe, at least, to a greater volume probably than the Americans did in most places. So Britain was deeply in debt to the United States. Their infrastructure was disrupted. They had lost a lot of people. They were in a state of that really wasn't commensurate with the continued control of large parts of the world. Britain was no longer the empire that it had been, even if nominally it controlled still vast stretches of land on every continent. The United States most certainly had emerged as the great power, and we'll see that the relationship that the U.S. had with Britain would be pretty important here. France was even more damaged, not only war-torn, the site of numerous battles, a German occupation, a corrupt puppet government in Vichy. France was really a mess at the end of the war. De Gaulle had tried to claim victory for the French, really kind of ignoring the fact that the British and the Americans had done most of the, supplied most of the manpower and the weapons and things like that. And the British and the Americans really had no interest in occupying France. They wanted to turn it over to de Gaulle and the Free French as soon as they possibly could. But France was really a mess. And as we'll see, the solution that the French came up with to try to rebuild their country was to, again, use Africa as the great piggy bank, to extract resources from Africa so that they could rebuild their country in multiple ways. Belgium had been occupied by the Germans. They had been, pretty terribly damaged as well, though not nearly as much as France was. And Belgium, by this point, was really just a kind of, well, not even a power. To say they had any kind of power in Europe would be to err completely or to exaggerate. Really, Belgium, by this point, had little business in controlling far-flung territories in different parts of the world, but like the French, they saw Africa as the solution to a lot of their problems of rebuilding and revitalizing. Portugal, who was probably the weakest, not for the reason of having fought in World War II necessarily, but the weakest of all of these colonial powers, ended up really doubling down on their control of Angola and Mozambique. As we'll see, they were in Africa for the longest time of all of these former colonial powers. The British, who were easily the strongest of all of them, ended up getting out first. And there were reasons for that. The British had other goals in mind. The Portuguese really saw no other alternative, really all the way to the 1970s, when they faced guerrilla warfare that was totally impossible to try to counter. Did they finally come to terms with the fact that they didn't have the power to control these African colonies anymore. Italy, which had been defeated as part of the Axis during the war, immediately at the end of the war tried to lay claim, tried to press their claims for continued governance of their former colonies in Africa. And the United Nations, which was formed at this point, became the arbiter of that. They did grant a mandate to Italy for Somalia in, I think, 1950. That was to last for 10 years. and that's all it did last. And Somalia was granted independence in 1960. But their claims to Libya and Eritrea were not heeded, and ultimately they weren't able to regain those territories. And Eritrea ended up, being mostly in British hands. I think there may have been some kind of Italian presence there for a little while, but these claims were again unheeded. And the former Italian possession of Libya ends up being a kind of experiment in granting independence to Africans, as we'll see. The one place where there really was, and so let me sum this up. With the exception of Portugal, and to some extent Belgium, who was intransigent for a time, the European powers were willing to talk about decolonization. They were willing to talk about the transitions in the way that they treated their African possessions. They were willing to think about a future where there were no more colonies in Africa, where these were autonomous or fully independent territories. For them, that was going to be a long way off, they thought, but they were willing to talk about it at the very least. The one place, or the one situation, I should say, where they were unwilling to discuss any alternatives in this direction were the places where there were large numbers of white settlers. So Algeria for the French, Kenya, and Rhodesia for the British, and especially South Africa, which really, by this point was becoming fully independent. 1948, there's an election, and the Purified National Party, now it's simply called the National Party, sweeps to power under Daniel F. Milan, with the assistance of the great architect of apartheid, Hendrik Verwoerd, who becomes the Prime Minister in 1958 of South Africa. And South Africa is moving more and more in the direction of independence until their final split with Britain in 1961. And so the white settler regimes were totally off the table in the European mind after the war. The United States did put a great deal of pressure during the war and in the immediate aftermath of the war on the Europeans, especially the British, with whom they were closely allied, of course, to get out of Africa, to go in a new direction, to grant independence to people. And this was especially the case with Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was an outspoken opponent of colonialism, and he made his opinions very well known to Churchill, and Churchill, kind of the arch-imperialist of an earlier era, one who had cut his teeth as a kind of reporter during the South African War, the Boer War, in the first couple of years of the 20th century. Somebody who had expressed great commitment to the whole imperial project, started to soften his stance under the influence of Roosevelt. However, the beginning of the Cold War and the threat of communism ended up overcoming the American tendency to impose imperialism. The Americans under the Truman and Eisenhower administrations were much more worried, much more careful about halting the spread of communism than decolonization. They would rather have a European power in place, controlling places in what they called the Third World by this point, in Africa, Latin America, and places like Southeast Asia. They'd rather have the colonial system remain in place than have those places turn over to communist rule. And really it's kind of the experience in the immediate aftermath of the war in Southeast Asia and Vietnam, with the rebellion of Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese communists, that starts almost immediately after the war to inform American and European opinions about this. The Cold War comes to dominate, in fact, the whole process of decolonization, the move to African nationalism, and things like this. It's a thing, a kind of cloud that broods over this whole era. The Soviet Union exacerbated this by expressing a great willingness to support any African regime, and moreover, we see the support they have for Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese, also for the dynasty of military leaders that comes to power in Kim Il-sung in North Korea, prompting the Korean War. And the Soviet Union certainly extended the same kinds of offers to support any African regime that wanted to break away from its colonial situation and become communist. And so the great fear here is that whole communist scourge in the minds of the Americans was going to spread to Africa. And that was probably a legitimate fear. The United Nations, like the League of Nations before it, issued mandates, but these were slightly different. The mandates issued by the League of Nations were really open-ended. There's not a lot of direction given, only a kind of vague appeal to eventual self-determination with no kind of timeline. UN mandates tended to have timelines. I talked about the Italian mandate for Somaliland or Somalia, which was to be for 10 years, during which time they were to prepare them to become independent. And not all of these had very strict timelines like that, but there was an avowed goal and sort of some measure of accountability for this on the part of the Europeans to lead Africa to self-determination. And so the UN called for greater development in Africa with an eye to creating a situation, a stable situation, which could then, lead to independent African rule. And so there's more pressure now, as of the end of World War II, for a variety of reasons put on these European powers. However, the expected timetable for this, although there were some time limits put on some of these mandates, the Europeans, and probably to some extent American officials, and even maybe some of the leaders of the UN, thought that Africans would take decades. In fact, I think there even is some rhetoric at times that maybe by the beginning of the 21st century, Africa will be ready to lead itself. So Europeans are really thinking long-term here, right? The realities belied that expected timetable. More and more Africans were calling for independence, were forming independence movements, their own political parties. All of these, or at least the vast majority of those who were doing such things, were leaders of, were Western educated. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah in the Gold Coast, and Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, and Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya. To say nothing of figures like Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu in South Africa. They wanted independence sooner. They wanted an end to colonial rule sooner than that. They wanted, at the very least, immediately, greater representation of their own interests in the European governments, even seats in Parliament, perhaps. And in some cases, the promise of those things were extended to Africans. But the Europeans are really thinking along different lines. The other part of the reality here is that these European powers simply don't have the resources to continue with the colonial experiment. They couldn't spare the officials, they couldn't spare the expense of running a colonial government, and they're really operating in ways that are really quite irresponsible here. Though I guess it could be argued that that doesn't change much from what was already in existence. And so the relations between Europeans and Africans really waffle in this period between compromise and conflict. African leaders would call for greater autonomy, greater independence, greater representation. The Europeans would capitulate to some extent, but not enough for the minds of the Africans, and so then that would lead to conflict, at times armed conflict, and then there might be greater compromise, and I mean this whole cycle went around and around numerous times over the course of the late 1940s and into the 50s and 60s. Economically, most of these European powers, but especially the British, especially the French and the Belgians, though, I mean, arguably the Portuguese had always kind of felt this way. They saw Africa as the key to their rebuilding. I've said that already, don't want to belabor the point too much, but that really is important for understanding why the Europeans were doing the things that they did. And this, there was a kind of post-war boom in Africa, especially of agriculture, as more companies pressed on by European governments began to invest in Africa, began to set up operations there, especially for the extraction of agricultural goods, like rubber and such things. There was there was a kind of boom here. In some cases, this led to an overreach. And so in Tanganyika, for instance, the British possession there, it was thought that, especially that ground nuts, like peanuts and things like that, would grow really, really well there, but that they could do this by setting up these large kind of mechanized plantations that could be staffed primarily by Europeans, by European settlers. And so this did not involve, more jobs for Africans, which is one of the things the Africans bristled at. And so they brought in, there was a lot of investment made in this groundnut scheme, and the image you see here on the slide is quite representative of what happened there. Here we have a train that is derailed, and that's exactly one of the problems with this and some of the other projects that the Europeans tried to put into place in the 1950s, and that is that the climate simply wasn't good, that it was hard on the machines, that in some cases things like trains derailed, and the soil proved not to be so good for the growing of groundnuts in Tanganyika. There were efforts made to grow cotton in other places, and these things didn't always fit. And the Europeans often came in and simply thought that they could apply the same agricultural techniques that were used in Europe and other parts of the world to the African situation. That doesn't always work. In fact, this is one of the great misunderstandings that many of these Westerners make in dealing with Africa. And so the whole groundnut scheme for enhancing Tanzania and making it into the world's leading producer of groundnuts ended up being a total disaster. And so part of the problem here is that the Europeans were trying in Africa to set up a kind of command economy. They set up marketing boards who were tasked, and these were staffed by Europeans, of course, were tasked with determining what would be the best use of the resources of the colony, and then those resources were brought to bear to build new plantations, or to try to mechanize parts of the production, or these marketing boards also saw to the hiring of African labor, but they didn't try to turn farms and things over necessarily to African peasants who probably could have worked the land better than these Europeans were trying to do from afar. So they would hire African laborers and pay them really very little for a lot of work, and the idea was that the marketing boards would be in charge of banking the surplus that would be produced in certain years, so that if there were lean years, that they could use some of that surplus to get through the lean years. And as command economies go, this one didn't work very well. Command economies tend to be pretty, in most cases, pretty abysmal failures, because it leaves out sort of individual innovation and entrepreneurial tendencies. But the marketing boards were really quite disastrous. And in some cases, they even were culturally offensive. And this is what led to a lot of protests among native Africans. One of the most offensive things done by the marketing boards was the culling of cattle. This is part of the kind of designed agricultural and pastoral economy, was that they determined that some of the herds that existed in parts of Africa were too large and were in danger of succumbing to disease, and they probably were correct at that. And so they would issue government mandates that certain parts of, or a certain number of cattle from each herd needed to be culled, needed to be killed. Well, the whole basis of wealth and prestige in society in these parts of Africa where cattle were raised in largest numbers was based on the ownership of cattle. The larger the herd, the more prestige. And so with the Europeans telling these pastoral cattle owners, or these rural cattle owners, that they have to kill some of their cattle was absolutely, that was anathema to their ears, of course. And so this led to, in some cases, to mass protests. There were also instances where they weren't supposed to cull the cattle, but the British and French forced the rural cattle owners to do what was called cattle dipping, which was to essentially pick up the cow and dip it into some kind of chemical solution to kill parasites. This is an attempt to limit the spread of disease among cattle. Given the African interpretation of things, this was seen as witchcraft. This was terribly, terribly offensive to these people, again, who relied for their prestige on their ownership of cattle. So these misunderstandings created a lot of bad feelings that would aid the rise of nationalist movements. In some places, notably in the Portuguese territories, there was an increase in European immigration. The rationale was that, with the difficulties caused by the war, some places were hurt by surplus population, or by a population that was too great for the infrastructure that existed in Europe. Portugal was struggling economically after the war. There was a kind of post-war dip as the European economy, like the American economy, transitioned from a war economy back to a civilian-based capitalist economy, and this left a lot of people destitute. A lot of jobs ended up being lost as a result of this, and for the most part, it was destitute, poor urban Portuguese and people from similar backgrounds from other countries who ended up going in large numbers after the war to Africa and trying to settle there. So there were fairly large numbers of settlers in Mozambique and Angola and a few other places. Maybe an uptick of immigration to Rhodesia and Kenya as well, and certainly to Algeria in the immediate aftermath of the war. Again, from the same kinds of people. This was hard to take for a lot of the Africans in particular, that they saw this as a real problem. And with the growing number of European settlers, and with the step up in the extraction of resources, the Europeans saw no other alternative than to suppress any sort of reform, to suppress any movement in the direction of change, in the direction of extending autonomy. And so we're really back to a situation by the early 1950s where Europe was, had reestablished their hold over their colonial possessions, and were making no moves to go in a different direction there. And so with the with the wartime promises made by Europeans to Africans not being fulfilled, with the political debts that they now owed to many of these leaders who had supported them during the war, with the promises being broken, this made Africans understandably quite upset. And the ones who really took up the mantle of leadership among Africans at the time were the educated elites. They were the ones who understood most keenly what was going on. They communicated best with the Europeans. They had a global perspective on things. They understood the movements, the economic movements of the international system, and things like this that were necessary for comprehending everything on the macro level. And they also appealed to Europeans. The indirect rule chiefs had, even in the minds of the Europeans, become incorrigibly corrupt by this point. They were really just out for a paycheck. They were not, for the most part, well respected by their people anymore. These had become hereditary positions, and those who had taken over from the first generation or two of chiefs ended up being just kind of puppets of the Europeans with no real hold over their people, who in many cases had expensive tastes and demanded more money and more luxury goods and things like that from Europeans. And so these educated elites who understood Western ideas and in some cases had Western friends and Western interlocutors were just more appealing. And the idea of the Europeans was that they would set up a kind of patronage and clientage situation, that these educated leaders of Africans would end up being good European clients, would be pliable, would be open to what the Europeans saw as reasonable talk about things. So they began to partner up, as it were, with these educated elites. Again, the exception was in the white settler territories, and again, the accepted timeline was much longer than what the Africans had in mind, and certainly much longer than what ended up actually happening in Africa. Now, the first really kind of move to independence, a test case, as it were, came in Libya in 1951. The UN rejected Italian petition for the restoration of Libya to them as a colonial possession, and instead decided to proclaim Libya independent. And so under King Idris, who you see pictured here on the slide, Libya was given independence, and a kind of elected representative system, a parliament was set up there. This was followed by the end of the decade by Somalia, and so these Italian colonies were sort of these experimental things. In both the transition to autonomy and the ultimate granting of independence. And, but there was no risk, of course, for the British and the French and the Belgians and the Portuguese in granting independence to the Italians, at least so they thought. But, of course, the colonial subjects of those other countries saw what had happened in Libya and saw the trend in Somalia and decided that they wanted the same thing. And so what we're going to talk about next time is the rise of African nationalism. This will take us back to some extent to events before the war. We'll backtrack a bit and then move into this era of the rise of independence movements and the quest for independence in the 1950s and early 60s. One final point here. I think that okay, that's it. The last point is we cannot underestimate, really, the threat of communism here. The kind of brooding cloud of the Cold War over all of this. that many of the actions the Europeans take under pressure from the United States have a lot to do with this fear of the spread of communism. In some cases, the directions that the independence movements go have a lot to do with their collusion with the Soviet Union. Even the African National Congress in South Africa, even figures like Nelson Mandela, for a time courted the favor of the Soviet Union. Some of Mandela's fellow freedom fighters were members of the South African Communist Party, and there were similar kinds of parties in other parts of Africa. In fact, Portugal is, again, the maybe the quintessential case here, that the Portuguese held on to their possessions for far too long, denying any kind of transition to African autonomy. And as a result of this, the people of Angola and the people of Mozambique became more and more embittered and turned to increasingly radical solutions, including the overt sponsorship and aid of the Soviet Union. Even the apportioning of communist troops sent from Cuba at one point to aid the rebels in fighting the civil war in Angola. So Soviets began to be heavily involved in some parts of Africa, and that would have an influence on the future course of independent Africa. So here we see what some scholars have called this move from a kind of Western-based nationalism, the desire for parliamentary governments and democracies and things like this, to a desire for an independent nation on any terms that they can get, including kind of radical totalitarian or communist systems. And so that whole dynamic there is going to be a key theme going forward through the next couple of decades of African history. Thank you very much.